If one winter day, in the middle of a gray, bone-cold marketplace, a little girl no more than 4 looked up at you with eyes both frightened and fierce and said, "Mister, can you buy us?" what would you do? Would you stop pull money from your pocket in front of dozens of curious and mocking stares to buy human beings? Or would you turn away, telling yourself it wasn't your business? And if I told you that the shackled woman on the auction block was the woman you once loved, the woman you had buried in your heart, the woman you had mourned until the tears ran dry 5 years ago, would you believe me? Winter of 1886, in the Colorado Territory near the Wyoming border, was so brutal it felt as if even the wind had bones. The cold went through a man's coat, seeped into his joints, and stayed there. At a shabby market thrown together beside an abandoned trading post, crooked stalls leaned against one another like drunks. The smell of dust mingled with rotting wood, and here and there the faint odor of old cured meat. People sold anything they could, saddles, rope cattle, and sometimes people. Thomas Beckett stood at the edge of the crowd. 39 years old, a cowboy who had traveled far and seen too much, he now chose a solitary life. His long coat was weather-worn, his hat brim low over tired eyes that had once burned bright, now nothing but embers. He had come here only to buy a horse, not to make friends, certainly not to look for love. Love to him had died on the night 5 years earlier when Sarah Ellison, his fiancée. His everything was consumed in the fire that gutted a boarding house in Kansas. Since then, he had lit a lamp under her portrait every night, a silent battle against forgetting. Through the calls of merchants, the jeers and the sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel, a sound small enough to be swallowed by the noise, somehow reached him. "Mister, can you buy us?" He looked down. A little girl no older than 4 cheeks, flushed from the cold, wearing a patched dress, stood with her back straight, as if trying to shield something in her arms. Wrapped in a worn scarf, a newborn stared out wide-eyed at the world. "Please, we won't cry," the girl whispered. Thomas's gaze followed the child's trembling hand toward the wooden block. There, a woman stood shackled at the wrists, head-bowed hair tangled like grass after a storm. A thin shawl clung to her shoulders, useless against the cold. She didn't beg, didn't meet anyone's eyes, only held the girl's hand with the desperate grip of a mother, refusing to let go. The gavel banged. The auctioneer's voice rang out. "Next lot woman fit for cleaning or cooking. Comes with 2 dependents." Starting at $10. Laughter erupted from one corner. "I'll give you $5 just to shut him up," someone shouted. Thomas stood still, jaw tightening. In his mind, the whistling wind of all his lonely years seemed to stop, replaced by the pounding of his own heart. 15, someone called. 35, Thomas said. His voice was calm, cold, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. Silence. Then the gavel fell again. Sold. He stepped forward, handed over the coins without a word. The little girl walked beside him, still clutching the baby. The woman stumbled after, never lifting her head. They left the crowd behind as snow began to fall, softening the path out of the market. At the edge of camp, beneath a frost-stiffened pine, Thomas stopped. He turned to the woman. "Ma'am, I need to see your face." She hesitated, then slowly raised her head. The pale light of the winter afternoon swept across her bruised features, over eyes that held untold stories. Thomas staggered back a step, the air punched out of him. "Sarah," he breathed, voice breaking. She blinked once, and then in a single heartbeat her lips trembled and her knees gave way. Thomas lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground, his hands shaking as they touched the face he had dreamed of in the dark. Not a dream. Not a ghost. She was alive. Have you ever thought you'd lost someone forever, only to have them appear before you, breathing, standing close enough to touch, yet carrying scars you never knew existed? What would you ask first? Why, or what happened? Or would you stay silent, afraid that if you spoke, they might vanish again? In that moment, with the wind biting around them, and the woman's breath warm against his chest, Thomas Beckett knew one thing for certain. The trip he had taken that morning to buy a horse had become the turning point of his life, and the question of a strange little girl, "Mister, can you buy us?" would echo in his memory forever. The first shot fired in a journey he never thought he'd take again, the journey to reclaim the woman he had lost, and the family he never knew he had. Snow was falling heavier now as Thomas led the three of them back to his cabin. The trail cut through silent pine woods so quiet the hoofbeats sounded as if they were coming from far away. Clara, still clutching the baby tight, walked beside him without a single complaint. Sarah followed a few steps behind her head, slightly bowed, her whole frame drawn inward as if she were folding into her own shadow. No one asked anything. No one explained. Every question sat heavy in Thomas's chest, like a weight he couldn't shake. When the cabin door opened, the warmth from the stove spilled out to greet them. But Sarah still didn't meet his eyes for more than a second. He handed them blankets and water, then stepped aside as though getting too close might cause the fragile reality he'd just found to shatter. Sarah eased Clara out of her thin coat, folded it neatly by the stove, then lifted Matthew against her chest, her hands cradling him with a silent tenderness that ached to look at. Supper passed in near silence. Thomas set out 3 bowls of hot stew sitting across from them, but avoiding staring too long at Sarah. His gaze kept finding Clara the way the little girl ate small, careful bites, as if afraid the food might vanish if she hurried. Matthew slept soundly, his tiny head against his mother's shoulder. And Sarah? Once in a while, her eyes flickered toward him, only to drop quickly back to the table. After the meal, Thomas showed them to the empty bedroom. Sarah murmured a "thank you," took Clara's hand and closed the door behind them. He stepped out onto the porch, letting the cold bite into his face, hoping it would wake him from what felt like a dream. Sarah Ellison had been dead for 5 years, but every line, every movement, the faint crease in her brow when she worried this woman carried them all. If she wasn't Sarah, then she was some cruel, twisted miracle. The next morning, Thomas woke to the sound of the door opening. Clara rushed in, cheeks flushed, breathing fast, her small body trembling. Sarah dropped to her knees, instantly wrapping the girl in her arms and whispering, "It's just a touch of fever. You'll be fine." Thomas didn't hesitate. He fetched cold water and a handful of dried herbs, pressing a damp cloth to Clara's forehead. She stayed close to Sarah but didn't pull away from his touch. Then, as he brushed a few strands of hair away from Clara's face, his eyes stopped cold. Just beneath her left earlobe, a small dark freckle, perfectly round, exactly like his own. Thomas's breath slowed. This wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. He looked closer and saw other things he hadn't noticed last night, the way her eyes narrowed when she concentrated the tiny purse of her lips when she was worried. His heart pounded not for the fever, but for the truth unraveling in front of him. If Clara carried the same birthmark as him in the same place, then she was his daughter. And if Clara was his daughter, then the woman behind that door? Sarah was Sarah Ellison, the woman he had lost, not someone else. Not a ghost. Later that afternoon, with Clara finally resting, Thomas stepped into the room. Sarah sat beside the bed, holding her daughter's hand, shadows deep in her eyes. He stopped just inside the doorway, his voice low. That mark, under Clara's ear. "She's really mine, isn't she?" Sarah lifted her gaze. Her eyes shimmered, but they were steady. She pressed her lips together, then nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered. "She's yours." In that moment, everything Thomas had buried came surging back, regret, grief, and something that felt like hope, but hit harder, almost like fear, the fear that this could be a dream. He turned away, gripping the back of a chair as if to steady himself, and let out a long, slow breath, the kind that carried 5 years of silence with it. Have you ever had a single detail shatter everything you thought you knew? A birthmark, a glance, a tiny habit enough to erase every doubt. And would you let yourself believe it right away, or would you torture yourself with the thought, what if I'm wrong? Sarah didn't add anything more. She only bent to kiss Clara's warm forehead, holding her hand, as if afraid someone might steal her away again. Thomas stood there, watching something so familiar it hurt, yet so strange it felt like another life. Outside the window, the snow kept falling, covering every track that led to the cabin. Inside Thomas, snow was falling too, burying the old questions and making room for something else to resolve. He wasn't going to lose them again, not now that he knew the truth, not while his own blood was sleeping under this roof. That night, the fire in the stove burned low, its warm light curling into the cabin's corners. Clara slept soundly in bed, her breathing steady and warm. Matthew lay swaddled in the cradle, stirring now and then. Thomas sat in a wooden chair near the hearth, his eyes fixed on Sarah, the woman who had been silent all day, now sitting in the far corner, turning a cracked locket over and over in her hands. He knew it was time to ask, not just because he needed the truth, but because some part of her seemed to want him to. "Sarah," he said quietly. She flinched slightly but didn't pull away. She simply waited. What really happened that night? In the firelight, her face was caught half in shadow, half in gold. She hesitated, as if gauging whether he could bear what she was about to tell him. Then a long, trembling breath left her lips, and she began. That night at the boarding house, the fire wasn't an accident, Tom. They set it. To make it look like I'd died. Thomas straightened, his heartbeat pounding. Sarah went on, her voice, even though it broke in places. A wealthy, cruel man bought me. He hired men to set the blaze to burn my room, my letters, everything that tied me to you. By the time the flames took hold, I wasn't in there. They dragged me out the back, gagged me, bound my hands, and shoved me into a wagon. Thomas clenched his fists, feeling the blood in his veins run hot. He forced his voice to stay steady. And then, they took me west, along the way. I was shot. Not to kill, just to keep me from running. They tied me to the wagon, fed me stale bread and cloudy water. When I could stand again, they forced me to marry a man not much different from the one who'd bought me. I carried Clara in that house. Her eyes drifted to Clara, sleeping peacefully, softening for a heartbeat. They never let me write. Never let me tell anyone I was alive. I thought, you'd forgotten me. Thomas wanted to tell her he had never forgotten, not for a single day, but his throat closed around the words. After Clara was born, I raised her quietly. I kept every story of you alive, every memory, telling them to her when it was just the two of us. It was the only way I could feel like I still belonged somewhere. She swallowed hard. A year ago, he died, fell from the roof. No one mourned him, but instead of freedom, I was sold with the children to pay a so-called debt. They dragged us from town to town. Last night, I thought it was the end, that I'd be torn from them for good. Thomas said nothing. He heard the wind rattle against the shutters and the pounding of his own pulse in his ears. For 5 years, he had blamed himself for not finding her. But the truth was, no one could have found her. Everything had been staged to erase her from the world. He didn't know whether to be grateful she'd survived or broken by what she'd endured. I tried to die every day. Sarah said, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut. But Clara, she made me live, even if just a little. Thomas moved closer, lowering himself beside her. His hand brushed hers. I thought, I'd never find you, but you're here. She looked at him, her gaze holding a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. You won't leave us again, will you? His fingers tightened around hers, solid as a vow. No, no matter what. Have you ever waited years for an explanation, only to find that when it came, you didn't know whether to smile or cry if the person you loved came back, but carried years of chains on their shoulders? What would you do first, hold them close, or fight to give them justice? The fire popped softly in the hearth. Outside, snow kept falling, blanketing the night. Inside the cabin, 2 people sat with their hands clasped, one holding a stolen past the other, a fragile present, both staring toward the same single truth: they would not let history repeat itself. The wind that afternoon carried a strange scent, not the clean bite of snow, but the smell of horsehide and men who didn't belong. Thomas was splitting firewood out front when he caught the sound of hoofbeats rolling in from the eastern ridge. At first it was a single rhythm, then several merging together. He straightened, gripping the axe handle, eyes fixed on the frozen track. From the gap between the pines, 3 riders emerged. 2 wore worn brown coats. The third, in a long black duster and a bowler hat pulled low, came straight down the trail without slowing. The man in black dismounted first, his boots crunching through the brittle crust of ice. A thin, humorless smile curved under his mustache. One gloved hand held a folded piece of paper. "You, Thomas Beckett?" he asked, voice dry as windburn. Thomas didn't answer, only shifted a step forward to put himself squarely between them and the cabin door. The man held the paper out, his tone sliding into false civility. "I'm here to collect on a debt. A woman by the name of Sarah Ellison, formerly Sarah Montrose, and her 2 children. The sale of her wasn't legal without my consent. According to this document, their property tied to an unpaid lien." Thomas took the paper, glanced over it. Crooked handwriting, a crude seal. No court in the territory would recognize it. He folded it once, then again, and slipped it into his coat pocket. "This paper's worthless," he said, voice low and flat. The man's brow lifted. "By the law as it stands, you're harboring stolen assets. I've filed papers in 2 counties. You can hand them over now or face trial. Your choice." Thomas's eyes flicked toward the window. Inside, Clara's small face was pressed to the glass, eyes wide. Behind her, Sarah stood frozen, Matthew tight in her arms. He turned back, voice slow and deliberate. "That's not property. That's my family. And you're trespassing." The man's smile vanished. "You think you can protect them? Beckett, you think a badge from 15 years ago makes you the law. It doesn't. We're the law here. We hold the ledgers and the paper, not the gun smoke." Thomas stepped closer, then closer again. His hand slid to his hip, drawing the Colt slow but steady. He leveled it, not at the man, but at the ground by his boots. One sharp crack split the air, shattering ice into shards. The man jerked back one hand, twitching toward his own gun, but not drawing. Thomas didn't blink. "I buried one life years ago," he said, voice like gravel. "And I know who belongs in the ground. You come back for what isn't yours. I won't be aiming at dirt." Silence stretched, broken only by the restless stamping of the horses. The 2 men in brown exchanged uneasy glances, their mounts shifting as if they too felt the tension. The man in black pressed his lips into a thin line, then gave a small, stiff nod. "You're making enemies with people who have more money than you can imagine, Beckett." Thomas's reply was short, unshaken. "I've fought men with more money." None of them had Clara's eyes. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the man whistled. All 3 horses turned, moving off through the snow, leaving churned white drifts in their wake. Thomas stood still until the last echo of hoofbeats faded into the trees, then lowered the gun. Behind him, the cabin door opened quietly. Sarah stood there, pale but steady, Matthew asleep in her arms. "They'll be back, won't they?" she asked. Thomas nodded, his voice as solid as stone. "They will. But next time we won't be facing them alone." She stepped closer, leaning just enough for him to feel her warmth through the coat. "We?" she asked softly. He met her eyes. "If they want to take what matters, they'll have to come through both of us." Inside, Clara peeked out from the doorway. "Mama, why'd the bad men leave?" Sarah smiled, her hand resting over Thomas's. "Because your papa told them to," she said. And for the first time, Thomas Beckett didn't feel the need to correct her. In that moment, he knew that no matter what danger lay ahead, he'd found something worth fighting for. Until the very end. Night fell faster after the confrontation. The sky had barely dimmed before darkness swallowed the forest around the cabin. Snow clung thick to the roof, the wind sweeping through hard enough to rattle the doorframe. In the kitchen, the fire burned steady, its light casting a warm glow over Sarah's face as she sat at the table, fingers laced together, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the wooden floorboards, as if searching for an answer. Thomas stood by the window, one hand still resting on the colt at his hip, as though the man in black might ride back at any moment. After a long silence, Sarah spoke, her voice low, but carrying the weight of something long, decided. "He's not going to stop, not just with us. There are others just like us, still out there." Thomas turned, seeing in her eyes not just fear, but fire. "So what do we do?" he asked. She drew a slow, steady breath as if bracing herself for the cost of her own words. "We tell it all. Write it down, send it to the sheriff. No more hiding." Thomas said nothing for a few moments. He knew what that meant, putting their names and faces out there, challenging the entire network Silas Kearney had built. But he also knew that if they didn't, someday soon, someone else would stand on an auction block like Sarah and those children had. He pulled out a chair, sat across from her, and laid a blank sheet of paper on the table. "Start from the beginning," he said. The pen trembled slightly in her hand as she dipped it into the ink. The lamplight shone over the first words she wrote to the office of the Sheriff County of Ridgewood. She wrote slowly, each letter carved as if into wood. "My name is Sarah Ellison, once declared dead in the fire at the boarding house in 1881. I was taken that night by a man named Silas Kearney, who runs a trafficking network under the guise of indenture. I am alive, and I testify that he forged my death, took my freedom, and has done the same to many others." Her voice slowed as she put down the names of each town, each house, each face she had seen sold like livestock. Thomas silently poured her a glass of water, setting it beside her, then returned to watch the words fill the page. She wrote of the house in Kansas, where she was kept, of the men and women shuffled through, like cattle, of fake debt ledgers scrawled by hand, of tea, laced with drugs to keep captives quiet during transport. When the pen finally stopped moving, she looked up at him. "Will you sign as witness?" Thomas took the pen, scrawling his name beneath hers in a bold, firm hand witness. "Protector. Believer." He folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, and pressed the edges tight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind combed through the pines. Inside, the silence was thick but not unwelcome. "Tomorrow at first light we take this to the town hall," Thomas said. Sarah nodded, placing her hand gently on his sleeve. "Thank you." He looked at her, not as a man given back what he'd lost, but as someone who had found a reason to fight. "I should have found you sooner," he said. She gave a faint, bittersweet smile. "You couldn't. Not until you were ready to save more than just me." In the corner, Clara giggled softly as she rocked Matthew's cradle. Hearing her children's voices, Sarah turned, and a rare smile touched her lips. Thomas watched them, knowing that what they were protecting wasn't just life. It was a family stitched back together from the ragged edges. And because of that, there could be no turning back. That night, before putting out the lamp, Thomas laid his revolver within arm's reach and hung his coat with the envelope tucked inside by the door. Anyone who came in the night would face both of them. But he knew the real enemy wouldn't creep in under darkness. The real enemy would come in daylight, carrying forged papers and smooth words. Tomorrow, they would bring the truth into the open before the law and the whole town, and let it spread like a fire Silas Kearney could never smother. Before bed, Sarah stood at the window looking out into the snowfall. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "we won't just be protecting ourselves. We'll be protecting people who haven't had the chance to cry for help yet." Thomas came up behind her, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and in that moment he knew clearer than ever that this fight, no matter how dangerous, was the only path to keeping them truly safe. The next morning, pale winter sunlight slanted across the valley, thin and cold as glass. Thomas roused Clara and Matthew, helping Sarah prepare for the trip into town. Her face was calm, but her hands were clasped tightly as she pulled on her wool cloak. The letter they had written the night before was tucked into the inside pocket of Thomas's coat, pressed against his chest, like a vow he couldn't afford to lose. The road to Ridgewood was coated in a thin layer of ice, the wagon wheels groaning as they bit into it. For most of the ride, Thomas kept his eyes ahead, calculating each turn, saying little. Sarah sat beside him, one arm cradling Matthew, the other holding Clara's small hand. The air inside the wagon was a mix of wool, damp wood, and quiet tension. When they reached the town square, a crowd had already gathered outside the courthouse. Word had traveled fast. Someone had said the reclusive cowboy from beyond the creek was bringing in a woman once declared dead. Curious and skeptical eyes followed them as Thomas helped Sarah down. Clara clung to her mother's skirt. Matthew slept soundly in her arms. Inside, the wooden floor groaned underfoot. A deputy motioned for them to step forward. At the far end of the room, Sheriff Ezra Malloy stood with his arms folded, his mustache twitching slightly as he studied Sarah. Thomas stepped forward, his voice deep and clear. "We request a public hearing for Sarah Ellison. My former fiancée declared dead, but here she stands, not just breathing, but carrying the truth." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Sarah, one brow lifting. That a fact? Sarah drew in a breath and stepped forward, her boots sounding sharp against the floorboards. "My name is Sarah Ellison. 5 years ago, I was taken from a boarding house in Kansas the night it burned. A man named Silas Kearney staged my death. I was held captive, forced into marriage, and I gave birth to my daughter Clara under those conditions. When my husband died, I was sold again, and I would have been sold once more if Thomas hadn't found me." A murmur rippled through the room. From the corner, a woman with dark hair streaked in silver rose to her feet, her voice trembling, but certain I know one of the women she's talking about. "My sister worked at that house in Kansas. We thought she ran off. She wrote once, then nothing. I remember you. You helped my sister hide one night. And I remember your room was empty before the fire started." The room erupted in low shouts and scraping chairs. Someone swore under their breath. The sheriff raised a hand for order, then turned back to Sarah. "You willing to sign this before a magistrate? I am." Sarah said, her voice steady. He nodded, reached for a clipboard, scratched out a few lines, then handed it to his deputy. "Send a federal wire. Name Silas Kearney. Full nationwide warrant. I want him in custody." The air seemed to pause for a heartbeat. The sound of pen on paper cut through the stillness. Thomas glanced at Sarah and caught the faintest smile, not of joy, but of release, like a stone finally lifted from her chest after 5 years of weight. Clara tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Does this mean we get to stay?" Thomas knelt, meeting her eyes. "No one's taking you again." Matthew stirred softly in Sarah's arms as if agreeing. The sheriff cleared his throat. "You'll need protection. Kearney's got men everywhere." Thomas stood, his voice as sharp as a drawn blade. "Let him come. I'm ready." Outside, the wind was picking up, but it carried no scent of fear, only the taste of a fight that had just begun. And this time, they wouldn't be alone. As they left the courthouse, the thin sunlight spilled over the wooden steps, casting the 4 of them into one unbroken shadow. Sarah's hand tightened around Thomas's as they descended, and in her eyes he saw not only gratitude, but the certainty that their road home had truly begun in that moment. In the days following the hearing, Thomas's cabin was no longer the quiet place it had been. The sound of small feet running across the floor, the crackle of the stove when Sarah baked the sudden bursts of Clara's laughter while playing with Matthew, all of it blended into something new, filling the empty spaces that had once held only the whistle of wind through the eaves. Each morning, while the fields were still covered in mist, Sarah would go down to the creek behind the cabin to gather smooth river stones. She'd line them up in the yard, take a stick, and carve letters into each one before calling Clara out to practice. At first it was just mother and daughter, but soon a boy from the neighbor's place started coming. Then 2 more children from the lumber camp, and a red-haired girl whose father worked the forge. Before long, under the shade of the poplar tree by the porch, 6 children sat on log sticks in hand, tracing letters in the dirt as Sarah guided them. Thomas often sat at the kitchen table, coffee still steaming, watching through the window. He'd see Clara bent over her paper, head-tilted lips pressed together in concentration, just like him, when he was focused. One morning she ran inside, cheeks flushed, holding out a scrap of paper. "My name is Clara Beckett," it read in careful, wobbly letters. Thomas took it, his throat tightening. That name was more than just a label. It was a bridge between years of loss and the life they had found again. In the afternoons, after the children left, Sarah bathed Matthew in an old tin basin. Steam curled up around the baby's soft hair. Thomas would pass through, pause for a moment, then slip into the back room. From the top shelf of a wardrobe he'd kept locked for years, he pulled down a dust-covered bundle. Inside was a daguerreotype of his parents, and a smaller one Sarah taken the summer they were engaged. Her eyes in the photograph were as clear as he remembered. He hung the two frames side by side above the mantel. Then quietly, he crossed to what was now Sarah's room and opened the top drawer of her dresser. From his pocket he took a small wooden box and set it inside. Resting on the worn felt was the engagement ring he'd never been able to give her. He left no note, just closed the drawer, knowing one day she'd find it. That night, after the fire had burned low, Clara came out of her room holding a little homemade booklet bound from scraps of paper. She climbed into Thomas's lap without a word and opened it to show him. Inside were childish, bright drawings, 3 figures on horseback, one tall one with long hair and one small with pigtails. Beneath, in her uneven hand, were the words, "We found the home you lost." Thomas read them slowly, a deep ache and warmth swelling in his chest. He looked up to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame he'd just hung. Her expression quietly moved. "I don't know what I ever did to deserve this," Thomas said softly. Sarah came forward, kneeling beside him and Clara. "You waited," she said. "You believed even when it hurt." Thomas looked down at the little girl in his arms, then thought of the ring lying quietly in that drawer. In that moment he knew this house was no longer just wood and stone. It was the place where his heart had found its beat again. The next morning, as Sarah called Clara in for her lessons, Thomas leaned against the porch post, taking in the sight before him. The little girl who had once stood trembling at the auction block was now sitting confidently among friends, tracing neat letters in the dirt. The woman he'd thought gone forever was smiling as she corrected their work. He knew the past had left its scars, but these voices, these eyes, and the name Clara Beckett was how they would make up for the years stolen from them. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas stepped outside to find the sky spilling over with stars. Sarah joined him, draping a scarf over his shoulders. They stood there in silence, both understanding that this family had been reborn, not just by blood, but by resilience, by trust, and by the stubborn will to hold on to each other, despite everything they had lost. Winter had passed quietly, leaving the valley with only the last traces of ice melting under the new sun. Spring air on the high plains of the American West carried the scent of fresh grass, damp earth, and pine resin, the kind of smell that reminded you no matter how long the snow stayed, life always found its way back. Thomas Beckett stood on the hillside where he and Sarah had once spoken of a future together. Back then, they were young hands clasped, unaware of the storms ahead that would steal everything from them. Now he returned, wearing a freshly laundered white shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, his hat resting at his side. He carried no gun, only a braid of prairie grass he'd woven with his own hands that morning. The slope leading up to the hill bloomed with wildflowers. Sarah walked slowly, her simple white dress fitting neatly at the waist, her hair loose, catching sunlight with every step. In her arms, Matthew slept soundly, wrapped in a woolen shawl. Clara walked ahead barefoot, holding a bouquet she had gathered from the meadow below, yellow lavender and pink mingled together just like their journey, thorny, painful, but still bright at the end of the road. A small circle of friends and neighbors stood nearby: Sheriff Malloy, Widow Merle from down the ridge, the old pastor from Riverbend, and a few folks who had witnessed their story since the day Sarah stepped into the town hall. No bells rang, no white tablecloths, no polished silver, just earth, sky, wind, and people who believed in what they were doing. When Sarah reached him, Thomas took Matthew from her arms, cradling the baby to his chest. Clara handed her mother the bouquet. They stood facing each other, eyes locked, as if the whole world had faded into the background of this moment. Thomas didn't kneel and pull out a ring. Instead, he took the braid of grass and wrapped it around both their wrists, tying a simple knot. Not a vow for show. He said, his voice deep and steady against the wind. No altar, no choir. Just us, a promise made in dust and blood, and in all the years we lost. Sarah, I am yours, even the broken parts. Sarah bit her lip, her eyes wet, but her voice unshaken. I have always been yours, even when the world called me dead, even when I couldn't speak your name out loud. It was always you. Thomas tightened the braid, then pulled her closer. They touched foreheads, eyes closed, and beside them Clara wrapped her arms around their legs, whispering like it was a truth written in stone. This time we stay together. No one clapped loudly. No one shouted blessings. The silence carried the weight of mountains of true witness. When the pastor stepped forward, he simply laid a hand on their shoulders and spoke a quiet blessing. The ceremony had already happened long before, when they decided to protect each other when they stood up to Silas Kearney, when Sarah signed her testimony. Afterward, they lingered on the hilltop, looking down at the valley bathed in golden light. Clara ran in circles, tucking flowers into her mother's hair. Matthew opened his eyes, staring up at the man holding him not out of duty, but by choice. Sarah leaned back into Thomas's chest, Clara curled in her lap. They didn't speak much, just listened to the wind, and felt their heartbeats slow after years of running. In America, where Western love stories often end with a rider disappearing into the horizon, or a gunfight unresolved, Thomas and Sarah's moment was something different, a victory without noise. They weren't rich, they weren't famous, but they had reclaimed the most important thing, the right to choose a home and a future no one else could take. Looking at them now, you might ask yourself, would you wait as Thomas did? Would you, like Sarah, speak the truth not only to save yourself, but to save others? Their love wasn't a fairy tale. It was built from lonely nights, scars, and the hardest decisions. If this story stirs something in you, support them not just with words, but by believing in the lives still out there, fighting for freedom and truth. You might never meet Thomas Beckett in the flesh, but somewhere there's a Sarah who needs someone to stand up for her. Be that someone when the chance comes. And for Thomas and Sarah, there's only one piece of advice worth giving. Hold on to this embrace. Don't let the world wedge itself between you. Tell your story to Clara, to Matthew, and to anyone who needs to know that love doesn't just survive loss. It can be reborn, stronger, brighter, and fierce enough to stand against the dust and wind of the West. As the sun dipped fully behind the mountains, the shadows of the four of them stretched long across the hill, blending with the fading gold of the grass. No longer the silhouettes of lonely survivors, but the whole shape of a family, one you can't help but hope will stay together always.